Okay, so what we're looking at right now is timers in video games, and timers are something that's often overlooked by a lot of people. For example, most people don't realize how much timers are used in games. They're used for almost everything you can think of. Simple games like shooters, there might be a certain amount of time in between every bullet to ensure that the user's not spamming the shoot button too fast. If you're playing adventure games, there might be a certain amount of time that you have to wait before you can use your next weapon or use your super weapon or something like that. If you're playing a space game, there might be a certain amount of time that's passed before the next enemy is spawned. There's timers that count, for example, the total amount of time the game is played. If you're playing Super Mario Brothers, every level has a set amount of time. There's so many reasons that we use timers. And as such, what we've done is we've added a mechanism inside of the game utility library to take advantage of those. So the two main types of timers out there that exist are infinite timers. So these are timers that are kind of like a clock that continually counts up. They never end. And then there's trigger timers. These are more like alarm clocks. You give them a starting value and they count down until they hit zero, at which point they go into a finish state, which you can then detect and perform whatever action it is that you want to perform. So in order to do this, we're going to have to understand that there are two main values that we really care about: the amount of time passed and the target time that we're looking to get to. These two values really kind of trigger everything. And how does it work? How do timers actually work? Well, once you've created the timer, it's simply a matter of updating the timer with the amount of time passed since the last update has occurred. And then depending on whether it's a trigger timer or an infinite timer, you're going to treat it differently. Right after you're done updating it, a trigger timer, you're going to check to see whether it's finished or not. If so, you're going to perform whatever action it is you want to perform. If it's an infinite timer, you may not be triggering anything, but you may be checking its current value to display on the screen, or maybe you're checking to cause certain things to happen whenever the timer exceeds certain amounts. So, for example, maybe every 30 seconds or something, you make the game more difficult by adding more enemies or whatever it is. So we also have a lot of other functionality that are built in the timers as well. So for example, you can pause and resume timers. You can display the values. You can retrieve a ton of different data. So I've summarized the main functions that we have down here, and I'll go up to the how to do it in a second. But we have the ability to update our timers, activate our timers, deactivate our timers. We can toggle the timers to paused and unpaused. We can reset our timers by simply resetting it back to its starting value, or we can reset it with a new target time. We can check to see what state it's in. Is it finished? Is it active? Is it paused? Is it inactive? Those are the four main states. And then we have a whole bunch of getter methods that are meant to retrieve data about the timer, either the time passed or the time remaining. And you can get that in a number of different formats. If you get the time passed as is, you'll get it in terms of a double value, a decimal place. If you get the time passed as an int, you're going to get the total number of milliseconds as a whole number. If you get the time passed as a string, so you can see down here there's four different options for formatting. So when it says int format, it means you're going to use one of these four options. So for example, if I use the first one, it's only going to give me the milliseconds. If I use the second one, it's going to give me the number of seconds followed by a period followed by the milliseconds. The next one would be minutes colon seconds dot milliseconds. And then finally hours colon minutes colon seconds dot milliseconds. So this is more so you can get it as a nicely formatted string to display to the users. And just like get time passed and get time passes int, there's get time remaining and get time remaining as int as well. Obviously, this get time remaining and get time remaining int, all the remaining ones don't really make sense to use when you're talking about an infinite timer, but they sure do make good sense if you're talking about a trigger timer. So those are the main methods that we have. So how do we actually do or use a timer in our code? Not a whole lot of code required, but let's go over it. First thing you're going to do is you're going to create a global variable that represents that's going to be your timer object. So three examples I have here: maybe you have a shoot timer, maybe you have a message timer, and maybe you have an infinite timer to keep track of the game time, the total game time passed. So once you've created the variable globally, you're going to go and load content, and you're going to finish instantiating it or setting it up. So this is where we do the equals new timer piece. And when we instantiate it, it has two parameters: the target time. So this is the total amount of time you want that timer to last for. And if you want it to be an infinite timer, then you're going to use timer.infinite timer there. And then bool activate. So this basically means, are you starting the timer immediately, or are you going to start it later on? Are you going to manually activate it later on? That's completely up to you. It depends on the type of timer you're making use of at the moment. And we're going to go through a demo that does both. So here's a couple examples of creating timers. So maybe I want to allow, for my shoot timer, maybe I want to allow the players to shoot every half a second. So I'm going to pass in 500 milliseconds as the target time for this timer. Now, I am also going to say this is going to be disabled until the player shoots the first time, because I don't want them to have to wait a half a second at the beginning of the game. I want them to be able to shoot immediately. Then once they shoot it, I'm going to manually activate my timer. And then from then on, it's going to require a half a second in between each shot. Why? Because those are just the options that I chose. Message timer. In this case, a message timer is going to be used for when I want to display a message on the screen. I'm going to have it last on the screen for this amount of time, which means when I go to draw that string, I'm going to say, keep drawing this string as long as this message timer variable, that should be message timer, is active, right? So that way I know that it's counting down. Once it's not active anymore, that means the 2 seconds is done, so I shouldn't draw it anymore. Infinite timer, you can see me setting it up with timer.infinite timer, and I'm activating it immediately in this case. So back to kind of summarize. First, we create a global variable of type timer. Then we instantiate it or set it up with our target time and our activation status. And then the third step is to update the timer. And the update method is always called in the exact same way. So you have your shoot timer, in this case, and it could be any timer you want. So it's your timer.update, and then inside the brackets is always going to be this exact piece of code: game time.elapsed game time.total milliseconds. This basically gives the timer how much time has passed down to the fraction of milliseconds since the last time update was called, so it can keep a good running total. And that's it. That's all you have to do to actually make the timer work. After that, it's up to you to decide how to treat it. Maybe you want to check to see whether it's finished. Maybe you want to pause the timer. Maybe you want to reset the timer. Maybe you want to deactivate it, activate it, retrieve the timer's time remaining or time passed. So that's everything we have, relatively speaking, to our timers. Okay, so now what? Well, let's build a simple little program to demonstrate this. So I've created a starting program that has a whole bunch of data set up to start with, and then now we're going to edit it to make it do the stuff that we want it to do. So here's my plan for this program. We're going to have one timer, the game timer, which is going to keep track of the total time passed. And that thing is going to start immediately and keep tracking that time. Okay, our game is going to last 20 seconds. So we'll add another constant here. So let's say const int total time. We want that to be 20 seconds. So we'll say 20,000 milliseconds. All right. So we're going to keep playing until that game timer reaches total time. Okay. I also have a trigger timer, which is going to be my spawn timer. So not immediately, there is going to be a spawn timer that's created, but it's not going to be activated immediately. We're going to activate it when the user hits the space key. That will start the spawn timer. Okay, and then it will spawn an enemy. Really, all we're doing is keeping track of how many enemies spawn, just an integer. We're not actually spawning any enemies. It's just a demo, right? So we have two timers there: our total game timer and the amount of time it takes between us spawning enemies. And then finally, just like in the document a second ago, we're going to put a message timer. So every time we spawn an enemy, we're going to display a message on the screen that says new enemy spawned, and it's going to last there for exactly 2 seconds. Now I have a few other variables in here to help us keep track of things. First up, I have an integer to keep track of how many enemies I have spawned so far, and that's all that we're doing for spawning enemies. It's just adding one. Down here, So our spawn time is not always exactly the same amount of time, so we can make it a little bit variable, a little variance in there. We are going to randomize. So you see I've already created the random variable up here. We're going to randomize a new spawn time between 3 and 4 seconds every single time we spawn a new enemy. This will add a little chaos to our programs, which is great. I have a couple strings here for just straight up messages that we're going to display. So for example, every time a new enemy is spawned, I'm going to display the message, new enemy spawned. At the very beginning of the game, we're going to tell the user that they have to hit the space to start the spawning of the enemies. Because remember, the spawn timer is going to start as deactivated to start with. And then when the 20 seconds is up, we're going to display the end message, which is just going to say simulation complete. The next bunch of variables here are just positions for that text. So we have our spawn count text location, so that's going to display the current spawn count. Spawn time text location, that's going to display the amount of time remaining on the spawn timer. Game timer text location, that's going to display a similar thing, but for the whole game time, how much has passed. And then game timer int, I'm actually going to display the game time twice, both using one of the formatted strings, and then just the straight integer of milliseconds, so I can actually we can actually see the difference in between the two. And finally, these two things, new spawn message, so this is for that new enemy spawned, and the start message location, I'm actually going to use that vector too for both of these two strings. Now you notice I haven't given them values yet, and the reason not is because I'm going to calculate them inside load content so I can center that text on the screen nicely. And then we have two fonts so we can display text, two keyboard states so we can get new keyboards or new keyboard input. So that's all we have for data to start with. And so what we want to start off with is, if we go back to our document, we already did step one, create our global variables. We have three timers here, our game timer, our spawn timer, and our message timer. The next step says go and do load content and finish instantiating them. All right, so let's go set up game timer. We know game timer is going to be an infinite timer, so let's see. Set up the inactive spawn timer first, okay. Set up the game timer to track the total. Let's do this one first. So I know game timer is going to be equal to a new timer. I have to give it two values, a target time and a bool active. Now we want this thing to be active immediately, but for target time, we want it to be an infinite timer. So we have to use that constant timer dot infinite. And then we're going to say true because we want it activated right away. In terms of the inactive spawn timer, well, we want this one equal to a new timer. For the target time, well, we want, remember, the spawn timer is a random value between that minimum value and that maximum value. So we're going to randomly generate the value right here, rng.next, and we'll say minimum spawn time and maximum spawn time. We can even add one on that to ensure we get the whole thing. And then finally, do we want it activated immediately? No, we do not. We'll set up that later on. So this spawn timer isn't going to get activated until the user hits that space key the first time. And then finally, we need the timer set up. We got an extra space in here. We need the timer set up for our message. So message timer equals a new timer. And this one is going to be our message time. And we do not want it active right away because it is only going to get activated whenever we spawn a new enemy. Okay, so we've finished the load content. Now the next thing it says to do is simply go update them all. Great. So I got good news for this. Even if your timer is not active, you can still update it. And what'll happen is it's smart enough behind the scenes, you don't get to see this, but inside of the GameUtility library, it will check to see whether it's active or not. And it will only do the work if it is actually active. So it's safe for you to call the update method even on things that aren't active. And that way it keeps your logic nice and simple. So that means down here in update, I've already set some comments up here so we can do all this. But we need to update all of our timers. So let's start with our game timer. So we have our game timer.update, and every single one of these we're going to pass in the same thing. See how it says delta time millis? Delta means change, so how much time has changed, how much time has passed. So we're going to use our game time dot, not game timer, game time dot elapsed game time dot total milliseconds. Okay. Now I'm going to be using this all 3 times, so I'm going to copy this so I don't have to keep typing it because it's long. Now I have to do the same thing for our spawn timer. I know it's not active, that's okay. And then finally for our message timer. Oops. There we go. So right now we have our timers all set up. And according to the document, it's now time to actually start using it. So I have some comments here to figure out what we should do. So it says always begin with user input. So that means that I need to check to see if the user hits space, I want to begin spawning enemies. So that means if the user hits space, I'm going to activate my spawn timer. Okay. So if, let's see if you remember how to do this, kb.isKeyDown, keys.space. Okay. And not previous kb dot isKeyDown, keys dot space. So whenever they hit the space key, I want to activate my timer. Now I want to be careful because activating basically resets the timer too. So I only want to allow this space to be pressed if the timer, if the spawn timer is not already active. So it needs to be inactive. So I'm going to say and spawn timer dot is inactive. So we only want to actually allow you to activate the timer if it's not activated yet. So spawn timer dot activate. You can see there's no parameters. We just got to call that. So that will actually initiate our actual spawn timer. That's all we need to do for that. The next one says, well, when the spawn timer triggers, so when it's finished, I want to spawn an enemy, I want to reset the spawn timer, and I want to display my spawn message. So what does that actually mean in terms of our logic? When the spawn timer triggers. So the first thing I have to do is detect that. So I can use an if statement that says if spawn timer dot is finished. If that is true, then I'm going to do the magic. What magic? Well, let's see. It's asking me to do a few things. First thing it's doing is asking us to spawn an enemy. Now in our simplistic system, all that really means is add 1 to enemy count. Done. Okay. Then it says reset the spawn timer. Okay. Spawn timer dot reset timer. Now when I open up my brackets, you can see that there's one of 2 options. The first option is just to choose an activate state, true or false. And that if you do that, it will reset the timer using the exact same time that it used last time. That's fine. But in our simulation, we're actually trying to randomize that spawn time every single time. So I'm going to actually go through the RNG thing again. RNG.next minimum spawn time and maximum spawn time. And I want this activated because I've already started spawning. Now, why am I getting an error here? Let's just make sure. Argument 1 cannot convert from int to bool. What did I? Oh, I went backwards. Sorry. That's why. Order matters, right? So it actually wants the activation status first, then the target time. There we go. No problem. So we've spawned an enemy, we reset the spawn timer, and it says display a spawn message. Now we know we don't actually display messages in update, but what we are going to do is start the message timer here so it starts ticking down. And the draw code is going to say, while that message timer is active, display my message. So all we have to do here to quote unquote display our spawn message is to start that message timer. So message timer dot reset timer, and we want to use message time, and we want it spawning going immediately. Again, I did it the wrong way. At least I'm consistent. There we go. So we have officially spawned. Now here it says, well, let's pause all the timers. Well, we're not going to pause. We're actually going to deactivate. Deactivate all the timers to end the simulation. That basically means no more. They're not going to tick down anymore. Okay. So whenever to end the simulation, after 20 seconds. Well, what keeps track of the time that's passed so far? Game time. So if game timer dot get time passed, I don't want that. I want get time passed int. Did I do that right? I think I was off by my method name a little bit here. Let's do this one more time. Get time, there it is, get time passed int, and no parameter. So all that's going to do is give me the amount of milliseconds passed as an integer. If that is greater than our total time that we set up, our constant, which is 20 seconds, then our game is done. So if that's the case, I'm going to deactivate all the timers. So game timer deactivate spawn timer. Oops, spawn timer deactivate and message timer deactivate. That's it. That is all of our game logic for our system. All we have to do now is simply draw everything on the screen. So at the very beginning of our game, the only thing I want to see on the screen is the game time, because the game time is always going. It's activated immediately. And we're also going to see a message that tells the user to hit space to begin the spawn timer. Once they click space, we're going to show all of the spawn related data. So that means the spawn time remaining, as well as the number of enemies spawned so far. After 20 seconds, we're going to display the message that says the simulation is complete. So that's everything we want to display. So it's a fair amount, but let's start off with, so I have these things and we want to draw them in this order, but that doesn't mean we have to do the work in that order. So let's start off with the most obvious stuff, which is drawing the game timer, since that one needs to be displayed at the very beginning. So we do our sprite batch.drawString, and we want to display, so I have two fonts loaded. I have a timer font and I have, what's the other one? Just type in font, message font. For our game timer, for our game timer data, we're going to use timer font because the other one's too big. And in terms of the text to display, we'll do something like game time : and then we'll just concatenate the data we want to display. So in this case, I want to display the text with a nicely formatted string. So I want to display both the seconds and the milliseconds passed. So I'm going to say game timer dot get. So we have a bunch of options here. I want to get time passed, because this is an infinite timer. It's going up. So get time passed as string. I have to choose my format. I want format seconds and milliseconds. All right, what else does it want me? Now it wants a position. So I have to go back up to the top and figure out which of my vector 2's is the position for this timer. And it's going to be this one right here, game timer text location. Okay, and the one after this is going to be game timer int text location, but let's use this one for now. Where do we go? There it is. We got to put that down there, and we have to choose a color. So let's make our game timer stuff, let's make it blue, color.blue. Okay, so in theory, we should be able to see this right now if we run our program, and it should actually be counting up, as long as we didn't make any mistakes. And there we go, we have our timer, and it's already counting up for us, and it's using the format we chose, which was seconds dot milliseconds. Great. So that's that one, but I also want to display the same thing again, but I want to display it as an int. So instead of get time passed as string, we're going to say game timer dot get time passed as int. And that's going to give us the actual integer value, and you're going to see what this looks like in a second. And we don't want this timer text location. We want that one, game timer int text location. And we'll use blue again, and let's see what the difference is. So you can see that it's basically the same data. It's just we're just displaying the milliseconds as is, instead of formatting it in this nice clean way. Okay, so there's our game timer. That data's done. Now we have this draw new spawn message if the timer is active. Well, which timer? If the spawn timer, if the message timer is active, sorry. So that's easy enough to do. So we can just do an if statement that says, well, if that message timer, not message font, timer, dot is active. That means it's currently going, because we only want to display it while that message is actually ticking down. So in this case, we want to do our sprite batch dot draw string, and we want to use, we'll use our, so this is the new spawn message. So in this case, we actually want our message font, the bigger one, and our text. So in this case, we want to use our string message that we did. So I believe it was called new spawn message text. Nope, that's not it. That's the actual location. Spawn message. That seems right. And now we want that new spawn message text location. And for this, we can say, let's say color dot yellow. Make it important. Make it pop. All right. So now whenever the message timer is active, it is going to display our spawn message in nice bright yellow. Okay. I just realized in update, did we set up the centered locations for our, sorry, not update, in our load content. Did we set it? Oh, here we go. I did set up the centered location already for us. So we centered it between the half the screen width minus half the measured string of the data. Okay, let's go back down to where we were. So reading our last comment here, if I ran the program, we wouldn't see anything for this because we're not actually, we might actually. We're not displaying the spawn message. So I just hit space and there it is. So we just spawned an enemy. That's going to stay on the screen for 2 seconds. And then there it goes again. Another one was spawned. We just can't see that spawn data. So that's what we're going to draw next. So it says begin and end the simulation with a prompt informing the user of as such. That should say as such, not of such. As such. When the simulation is started, display the enemy spawn data. So what does that actually mean? So begin and end the simulation with a prompt informing the user as such. So we want to display that start and end message, but which one when? So let's think about that for a second. The beginning of the game, what is active and what is not active? Which timers are active and which timers are not active? We know that the beginning of the game, that spawn timer hasn't been activated yet. So that's when we want to display the start message. So I could say, well, if spawn timer dot is inactive, if that is true, then I want to display the message sprite batch dot draw string, and we will use our timer font, and the text we're going to display is our start message at our start message location. And we'll use color dot. Let's use color dot red. All right, so if our spawn timer is inactive, we want to draw this. If it is active, we can do an else case. I guess not active. If it's anything but inactive, we want to actually draw our data for our what do you call it? Our spawning data. So that means the number of enemies spawned and the current spawn timer. So we have two sprite batch.draw strings to do here. So let's say sprite batch.draw string. And the first one we're going to use our timer font again. And the string text this time is going to be the number of enemy spawned. So I can write enemy spawned, and we'll just concatenate that with our enemy count. And then we need our text location. So that is our spawn. Let's see which one we got. Not new spawn message text. We just want our spawn time text location. Nope. Which one is it? Spawn count text location. There we go. And then we'll use color.white for this. Okay. And now we need to do our our spawn time. So sprite batch dot draw string timer font and we want our, let's say, spawn time, and we will concatenate that with our spawn time dot get time remaining. Let's say get time remaining as string. Sure, we'll do get time remaining as string, and let's do the same style that we did last time, which was seconds and milliseconds. So now we have that data. We need a position, which is going to be our spawn time text location. There we go. We'll use color.white again. Okay, so in theory, at the beginning of the game, we should see both these messages. So let's run our program. So there's our message. So I'm going to hit space, and there's our enemy spawn. So that message is no longer displayed because the spawn timer is now active. And every time that hits 0, we're going to spawn another enemy. We can see that it's counting up each single time. Now this simulation is supposed to go until we hit 20 seconds. We hit this, and we did, because our message is actually going to greater than or equal to 20 seconds, so that's fine. That's close enough. But you can see now it's showing our start message again. Press space to begin spawning enemies. We don't want to show that. The reason why it's showing it is because the spawn timer is now inactive again. Well, that's no good. We actually want it to show the end message. So when it is inactive, at the beginning of the game, we want it to show this message. But at the end of the game, we want it to show the end of game message. So we need to have another if-else statement that says if the game is at the very beginning, draw the regular text, otherwise draw the end game message. So in this case, it's probably easier to check the end game message because the only time that the game timer is not active is when it's actually finished timing and it's hit that 20 seconds. So that's a really easy if statement to write. So if game timer dot is inactive, and the only time this is true is when the game is done. So in this case, we're going to draw our end of game message. Otherwise, we're going to draw this start of game message. We don't even have to do any extra code for it. We just want to say else. So inside of here, let's do our last message, and this should be the end of our demo. Let's see, draw string. We want to write in our timer font. We want our message to be our end message. And we'll use the start message location just to keep it simple, just to keep it consistent. It's going to be a little off center, but that's okay. Color.red. All right, let's see if it worked. All right, let's hit space. And this is going to take 20 seconds because that's what we have it set to. We just spawned our first enemy. So again, every time that hits 0, it should spawn another enemy. And going over here on the right, you can see the timer ticking up. Tick, 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 tick. I don't know how many enemies we're going to get to. But this is a good way to run a simulation. Since we're randomizing the spawn time, we should get some variability. And we see we get our simulation complete. If I hit space again, it doesn't reset or anything like that because the logic isn't built to do that. We didn't set that up to do that. And that is it. We've added everything we want to add. And our game is pretty customizable. So you can see that in this one simple game, we applied 3 different timers in very different ways and in very effective ways. So that's how we use timers in our games. Hopefully you'll be able to apply this to something that you really enjoy. So from here on, good luck and have